The shocking moment of Johnny Depp on Jimmy Kimmel's show, you need to see. On a sweltering June night in Austin, Texas, the studio lights shimmered with the familiar promise of light, predictable entertainment. Jimmy Kimmel's show, known for eliciting easy laughs, had a guest who seemed out of place in that world of rehearsed comedy, Johnny Depp. At 61, the actor carried something heavier in his gaze than his usual rebellious charm, as if that interview chair were, in truth, a silent courtroom. What drives a man, discredited and exposed for years, to return to the spotlight on a late-night talk show? And what happens when laughter meets the resistance of someone who refuses to be a caricature? From backstage, the tension was almost palpable. This wasn't just another guest. This was Johnny Depp, not the icon, not the scandal, but the man. The audience applauded as he walked in, but his eyes didn't seem to be in a celebratory mood. There was something in his restrained steps, in his measured greeting, that hinted the night would take a different turn. The stage was set for another banal interview, but the real script was being written live, line by line, uncut. Have you ever stopped to think about what happens when someone refuses to follow the script? When the stage becomes a mirror, and jokes stop being harmless. The interview hadn't even begun, but the audience, and the entire country, were about to witness something unexpected, the unvarnished truth. Jimmy Kimmel, with his usual half-smile and sharp gaze, started the conversation with his trademark calculated levity. After a brief introduction about Johnny Depp's intense years, the host tossed out a jab disguised as a joke. Do you remember that event in New Orleans? I think Lena Fairbanks still has nightmares about that comment of yours. Audience laughter. The show's band punctuated it with a comedic note. Everything was going according to plan. But Johnny didn't laugh. His gaze remained fixed on Kimmel, as if that joke had awakened something old, unresolved. Without looking away, he kept a neutral but tense expression, like someone listening, digesting, and choosing the right moment to react. Kimmel, perhaps expecting a sarcastic comeback or a joke in return, continued. Lena even joked on a podcast that you should have won an Oscar, for cynicism. More laughter. But now, some of it sounded nervous. Depp ran his tongue over his lips, rested his elbow on the armchair, and took a deep breath. The studio, sensitive to the slightest deviation from the script, began to realize that this silence wasn't accidental. It was loaded, heavy. A producer in the back discreetly signaled to drop the subject, but Kimmel pressed on. It's just humor, Johnny. We need to laugh at these things, right? That's when the tension fully settled in. The audience, once noisy, began to quiet down. The laughter died in the air, replaced by an uncomfortable, almost complicit silence. Depp didn't respond immediately. He looked around the studio, observing the faces staring at him as if expecting an explosion. But what came wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous, the truth about to be spoken. At that moment, it became clear this wouldn't be just another interview. Kimmel's question, no matter how sarcastically wrapped, had touched a real wound. And Johnny, unlike in previous years, didn't seem willing to swallow another joke masquerading as an innocent remark. The game had changed, and this was only the beginning. The silence that followed was the kind you rarely see on live TV. It lasted only seconds but felt like minutes. The camera instinctively zoomed in on Johnny Depp's face. And there he was, motionless, eyes still locked on Kimmel, in no hurry to fill the void. Silence, often uncomfortable, sometimes speaks louder than a flood of words. And in that moment, it was screaming. Kimmel tried to lighten the mood with a forced chuckle, making a trivial comment about Depp's new outfit, a desperate attempt to regain control. But the actor didn't take the bait. He leaned forward slightly and, in a firm yet measured voice, said, "Do you still think this is funny?" The question wasn't directed at the audience. It was aimed straight at Jimmy. And it was an accusation. One delivered without shouting, without outbursts, but with the force of someone tired of swallowing slander disguised as humor. The audience, who had been laughing freely moments earlier, now shifted in their seats. The tension was real, unscripted. Personally, I've never been one to idolize celebrities, much less absolve their mistakes. But there's an abyss between criticism and public humiliation. Watching Johnny Depp in that moment was seeing a man who had been reduced to headlines, memes, and late-night monologues, finally pushing back. Not with rage, but with presence. Kimmel, visibly thrown off, replied with a hesitant, "It was just a joke," but the words rang hollow. Because everyone there, live or at home, had already understood, the tone had shifted. The studio, usually filled with rehearsed laughter, was now steeped in honest discomfort. And that discomfort, I confess, felt necessary. Sometimes, silence is the first sign that someone has decided to stop playing the role assigned to them. And in that instant, Johnny Depp was no longer the passive interviewee. He was the man who had chosen not to laugh along, and that made all the difference. With the silence broken, Johnny Depp lifted his chin and stared not just at Kimmel but at the game itself. "The story with Lena was twisted from the start," he said calmly, yet with unmistakable resolve. It was a comment taken out of context, amplified by headlines thirsty for blood. No one cared what really happened. The funny version always sells better. Kimmel tried to interject with, "But you understand how it sounded to a lot of people?" But Depp cut him off with elegant precision, "I understand perfectly. Because I've learned that in this industry, perception matters more than truth. And with cancel culture, it doesn't matter what you did. It matters what they said you did." The audience watched in absolute silence, as if each of Depp's words stripped away a layer of varnish from the carefully scripted interview. The actor wasn't just refuting accusations, he was challenging the entire system that turns cynical remarks into headlines and others' pain into late-night monologues. Then, looking straight at Kimmel, he fired, "You're part of it, Jimmy. This culture of laughing at others while applauding your own virtue. How many times have you used someone's pain as a punchline just to fill 2 minutes of airtime?" Kimmel swallowed hard. He tried to recover, but the tension was now etched into his posture. The mask of the comedian had cracked, revealing the unease of someone confronted with their own weapons. This was no longer about an old incident. It was about systemic hypocrisy. About an industry that cancels for convenience, exploits for ratings. And above all, about a man who, tired of being a character, decided to become the author, live uncut. Trying to regain control, Jimmy Kimmel took a deep breath and asked a predictable, almost bureaucratic question. "Well, let's talk about your new movie then. What can fans expect from this next chapter?" Johnny Depp didn't blink. His response was razor-sharp. "Do you want to talk about cinema or public judgment?" The audience, in a rare moment of alignment with the guest, erupted in applause. It wasn't just support, it was relief. As if someone had finally named the silent farce that had fueled so many of these shows for years. This was the moment Depp took the stage as the real protagonist, not an easy target. Kimmel forced a smile, but the spark in his eyes was gone. He tried to pivot, calling the new film a return to classic Depp, but his words felt weightless, soulless. Johnny continued, "You know what's changed, Jimmy? I used to act to escape my reality. Now I act to face it. And when you survive being publicly torn apart, every scene you shoot carries a piece of your truth." For the first time, the interview felt truly alive. Not because of the questions, but because of the answers. Johnny spoke like someone who owed no one anything. No apologies, no explanations. And that resonated. There was a new tension in the air, but also something inspiring. As if everyone, including those watching at home, understood that this wasn't just an actor promoting a movie. It was a man deciding where and when to tell his story. Jimmy, for a few seconds, accepted this new rhythm. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. The reins of the show had slipped from his hands. And for the first time in a long while, truth took center stage, not the script, not the joke. The truth. By the final minutes of the interview, what was meant to be a light-hearted farewell turned into something closer to a reckoning. The studio lights still blazed, but the atmosphere was one of confession, intimate, tense, almost sacred. A visibly subdued Jimmy Kimmel thanked Depp for coming and tried to wrap things up with a perfunctory remark. "Well, that was intense." But Depp wasn't done. He took a deep breath, adjusted the ring on his finger, and said, locking eyes with the host, "I never claimed to be perfect, Jimmy. Never asked for applause for being some kind of role model. But I also never made light of someone's pain just to get a laugh from an audience. The words landed like lead in the studio. There was no deflecting, no softening it. It was a direct critique, not just of Kimmel, but of the entire logic of entertainment media that turns suffering into spectacle. The camera cut to Jimmy's face. This time, he didn't smile, didn't deflect. He just gave a slight nod and replied. Maybe that one went too far this time. It was a brief moment, but profoundly human. This was no longer a game of Q&A, nor a clash of public personas. It was the meeting of two men, one carrying visible scars, the other perhaps seeing his own distorted reflection behind the sarcasm for the very first time. Silence returned, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. The kind of silence that only comes after something true has been said, when there's nothing left to add. As a viewer, I found myself standing between them. I thought about how often we laugh at things we don't understand, things we've never felt firsthand. And in that moment, with the cameras still rolling, Johnny Depp stopped being the controversial actor and became, simply, a human being stating the obvious. Pain is not a script. Suffering is not entertainment. By the next morning, clips of the interview flooded social media. But unlike usual, it wasn't the funny moments or punchline-laden edits that went viral. It was the silences, the glances, the pauses heavy with meaning. Johnny Depp's closing line, "I never joked about someone's pain to make an audience laugh," was everywhere, met with reactions ranging from introspection to raw emotion. Within hours, the episode became a symbol of something bigger, the exhaustion with an era that normalizes reducing people to labels and scandals. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, the audience was more interested in listening than in judging. Not because Johnny Depp had redeemed himself, or because Jimmy Kimmel had been cancelled, but because, on that stage lit by spotlights and expectations, a spark of truth had flared up. And truth, when spoken unmasked, has the power to rearrange everything around it. The impact wasn't confined to the studio. Media figures, journalists, and artists began debating the line between humor and responsibility, between entertainment and empathy. The interview stopped being just another talk show segment and became an inflection point, the kind of conversation that lingers long after the credits roll. Johnny Depp walked away without playing the hero. He wasn't seeking redemption or glory. But by refusing to be a ventriloquist's dummy for the public narrative, he exposed the fragility of the system that had labeled him for so long. He didn't leave as a victim or a villain. He left as someone who dared to say, on national television, what many feel but few have the courage to admit, that deep down, we're all just trying to survive the distorted versions of ourselves. And what if this interview wasn't just about Johnny Depp or Jimmy Kimmel, but about all of us? About how we treat others' pain as spectacle, how we forget that behind every headline is a real human being, flawed, storied, and brave. If you've made it this far, it's because you feel, like we do, that something in this conversation transcended entertainment. Was it uncomfortable? Was it necessary? Absolutely. Because sometimes, the silence between two sentences speaks louder than hours of scripted dialogue. So now the question is, what about you? Have you ever been reduced to a version of yourself you didn't recognize? Comment below. We want to hear your story, your perspective, your side. The conversation doesn't end in the studio. It starts here with you. If this video moved you, made you think, or rethink, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and of course, subscribe. Here, we don't make excuses, but we don't throw stones either. We talk, we provoke, and above all we listen. See you in the next episode. But until then, maybe take a moment to think, what's the cost of turning people into entertainment?